people tend to have hazy memories. I've been trying to clarify my memory as much as I can. Let me go back a ways, if I may, way back, not to the beginning of things, but close to it. The notion of online access is not particularly a new thing. In the 50s, late 50s, I was at Bell Laboratories, and we were using remote access systems that were commercially available via usually a teletype or something like that. But in fact, having online access to information was available. It was just not widespread. In fact, the first remote access to a computer was back in the 30s when again at Bell Labs, a set of people up in Massachusetts, someplace or New Hampshire, at the AT&T long lines radio relay station to Europe, got on a teletype connected to a relay computer at Bell Labs and ran it remotely and did things. It's an old idea. The changes happen courtesy of technology and other things, and a lot of them go back to some research done by a guy named Paul Barron at the RAND Corporation. Paul was looking at how to create reliable communications. Communications at that stage were largely over telephone lines, and so if you looked, again, I'm going to give this example, but just don't read everything into the example. AT&T back then worried about nuclear attacks, and so there were big bypass routes for telephone traffic around particularly susceptible places like New York, Chicago, etc. It was clearly not a very effective way of doing things, especially as technology advanced. Paul came up with the idea, at least popularized the idea, of using, taking a pile of information, breaking it into little pieces, and sending the pieces out independently, potentially, and at the end, gathering together and reconstructing the information. And basically, the kernel of the idea is to find a way to get from point A to point B, no matter what the connectivity is, assuming there is connectivity. And he wrote a series of books or papers that ran. They were fairly widely read. I was at Bell Labs at that point, and I read them too. I'll give you a slight war story, which I always found entertaining. We were interested in Paul's ideas, and we asked Bell Labs management, said we want to do an experiment. And they pro forma asked AT&T, is that okay? Although he didn't have to, actually. And AT&T came back, this was in the early 60s, very early 60s, and said, don't bother. There'll never be a data business. That matches roughly what's happened in the computer field. When I went to RAND, actually Paul became a mentor of mine. But the idea in back of this, chop things up into little pieces, scatter them into four winds, bring them together, was the kernel idea that got elaborated basically from then on. The DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, which was a R&D part of the Department of Defense, was interested in the idea as a research idea. And that's a very important point. It was not because they were worried about nuclear survivability or anything like that. It was an interesting idea, and they wanted to see if it could be made to work. And they funded a set of activities with a couple of industrial sites and a couple of academic sites to see if it could be made to work. SRI, MIT, UCLA, BB&N, both Berwick and Newman, to see if they could construct a network which behaved that way. And a very early version of what became known as the ARPANET was put together with a handful of schools and companies that actually did this thing of coming in with a stream of information, chopping it into little pieces, delivering it to where it was destined to go, and putting it back together again and shipping it out. In order to do that, you need a little computer called an IMP, interface message processor, which took these streams, chopped it up, and decided where they went. And that basically was about where things sat for a fair amount of time, until I was at that point at UC Irvine and managed to get an IMP through some research I was doing. But it was basically a nice little toy that was usable, but if you happen to be at one of the schools that were connected to it or one of the companies, you could use it. That clearly was not going to go very far at that point. A number of us got together in Philadelphia Airport, of all silly places. I'm trying to remember why it was Philadelphia Airport, but it was. And realized that we had a problem on our hands as computer scientists. Computer science had suddenly blossomed, courtesy of Sputnik. Everybody wanted a computer science program because obviously Sputnik was needed technology. Computer science grew into its own. The first universities started offering PhDs in computer science very slowly. There was some undergraduate programs. I forget who. There's a big argument over who did what, but certainly Georgia Tech, UCLA, et cetera, were certainly involved in that. Okay. Bunch of us got together at Philadelphia Airport, realizing that what's happened now is there were a significant number of computer science departments being established around the U.S. in particular. So the focus was U.S. And research is very hard to do when you have one person looking at systems or one person looking at algorithms. They need people to talk to, and most of these schools had one person of this, one type of that, one type of that. And the field was not getting any place because it was very difficult to collaborate. These were in the days when a phone call across country would cost you a couple bucks for a 3-minute conversation. And those were old dollars, not current dollars. So you just did not go around making long phone calls. And that was really stifling the field. So we proposed to the National Science Foundation that we take this technology, which was being developed in the ARPANET, and see if we could extend that to computer science departments, university computer science departments around the country. After a little bit of interesting negotiation, we actually got the permission to do it and money to do it, more importantly. Still based largely on ARPANET technology. So, which meant that it was impractical to be able to put IMPs, these little computers, at every university around the country. It just wasn't feasible. The data lines weren't there. A lot of stuff wasn't there. So basically, we did a finesse, as usual in this business. We decided we'd use telephone lines for some traffic, some things, ARPANET for others, depending on where we were going. And we'd be able to send email at least around between researchers and universities. That got developed. We did a finesse at that point. The finesse was that we were told by the NSF that they'd fund us for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, if the departments, if the schools weren't willing to pay for it, then they didn't find it useful and make it go away. So we charged a very small amount for universities and charged an awful lot for industrial research labs who wanted on because they wanted to recruit students. And students were saying, even at that stage, can you connect, IBM, can you connect us to computer science net because our friends are on it? And that was one of the things that was in the decision process of researchers. There was a big job market opening, so it was, anything helped. So we charged them a fortune and charged universities next to nothing. Okay, so now you have the beginnings of at least an email. Now, there were other email networks. There was something called UUCP, which was software on Unix systems that behaved roughly the same, but was not really good for the type of flexibility we wanted, because it couldn't connect across to the ARPANET, which was growing also. That was military. CSNet was civilian. Okay? An arrangement was made, which set a precedent for a lot of things in the future, that we'd establish a gateway, a peering relation, to use the term, between ARPANET and CSNet, that traffic could flow over. And the assumption we had, since there were two government agencies funding that, is that traffic was equal in both directions, so there'd be no charge for anybody. So we managed to connect these two networks together, and suddenly the ability of people to communicate blossomed. Okay, it's a slow march to where we are now, but it's roughly what happened. Okay. Very early on, we got requests from foreign countries, Japan, China, some European countries, saying, why can't we join in? And in some cases, they were connected through the ARPANET, so that was not a problem. But other cases, we established a hub, actually at the University of Delaware, where people could call in, connect, and swap email. Okay, and then that would go out wherever it went on this computer science network. And we made a decision back then that rather than deal with a lot of people, because China in particular, there were 5 people that said they wanted to establish their network. And we said, no, fight your own battles, come to us with one place, and we'll talk to you. We're not going to talk to 5 of you. And that blossomed. And again, since we were connecting to a computer science network, there was no political problem. Okay? But that early on established a principle that's been very slow to get away from, which is everybody wants to talk to the U.S. We're the important things. These other countries want to. And so they paid access fees. They paid for the telephone calls. And that actually went on for a long, long time. It's beginning to unwind now. But that was strictly a budgetary issue for us. We didn't have the money to call Europe. They had the money. So that blossomed, and pretty soon we had a lot of connectivity, again, among the computer science departments around the world. Japan developed its own network. China developed its own network. They connected to us. For a while, we were the place that redistributed to all these foreign networks, CSNet. The NSF, well, actually, the computer science, 70s, early 70s. Computer science people were became sick and tired of other departments at the school saying, why can't we use your network to talk to our colleagues? And we were not running a computing center. So we went to the NSF and said, look, why don't we have a program which expands this? And 3 of us wrote an article in Science, which, if you haven't read Science, is an interesting magazine. It's about 1/3 real good policy stuff, and the other 2/3 is biology I don't understand. But it's a big way to get at policy people in Washington, proposing a science net. It turned out that name was copyrighted, so we ended up calling it National Science Foundation Network. And it was designed to take and fund the development of school-wide facilities in universities using the same underlying technology, or technology that was developed as a result of that. Okay. That was funded and went online. At the same time, the ARPANET technology, these IMPs, things like that, was sort of getting ragged around the edges. And Bob Kahn and Vince Cerf and others developed a different set of protocols, different set of rules that became TCP/IP, our current internet protocols. My students' father problem, John Postel was one of my students who was a pioneer in that. Steve Crocker was not quite a student, but close to it. And Paul Malcopetros developed the domain name system, and he was one of my students. So, it was a small group of people involved in this, and you basically knew each other or through your students quite often and around the world. So TCP had been developed, and that gave a much more flexible mechanism for connecting things together. It was supposed to be able to carry traffic from anything, and if you had 2 tin cups, you could theoretically use the communication line of a piece of string to send information back and forth. I think Vince said he tried that once and it worked, but it was obviously pretty slow. But the notion was there. Now, it turned out that part of it is very seldom used anymore. But now we're transitioning into a world where a new set of players were in the act, and these were regional networks, usually academically centered, which provided connectivity services using TCP protocols and routers, et cetera, to universities. And so you had a California system, you had a southeast United States system, a New York State, NISANet in New York State. You had basically regional networks that provided services on not-for-profit basis or fee, not-for-profit in a big sense, to the universities in their environment. And that sprung up all over the country. Some of them were funded by state help money, like NISANet had state and federal money. But basically, there was now a richer service with much faster communication system. No longer was your mail going over telephone lines. You had 50 kilobit lines connecting these, which was gangbusters, right? 50 kilobits, my God. A bit of history for those who enjoy history. Bell Labs, when I was there, we had just developed a 300 bits per second acoustic modem. Yeah? A revolutionary idea that you put a telephone receiver in this little pad and you could whistle back and forth to each other. The people who developed that told AT&T, again, looking forward, that they could actually go much faster, 1,200 bits per second. And AT&T said, you don't need that. The teletypes only work at 300 bits per second. They did it anyway, and so we rapidly got acoustic modems and then plugged in, to where we are now. But a lot of this was completely unplanned. I think that's one thing, technologists pushing the field. So NSFNet,
which is how important was Carterphone to that?
Carterphone was basically the connecting of devices to the telephone system. For a long time, you couldn't connect anything to the telephone system. You couldn't even put a pad on the handset. AT&T said that, no, that's ours, keep your bloody hands off of it. Carterphone sued, won, and that constraint went away, and eventually the electrical connection went away. That for a while was big kludge that you had to buy an interface thing. That went away because there was no technical reason for any of that. It was basically trying to keep your business. Okay, going fast, yeah. So you had these regional networks. You had universities connected. You had more and more industrial places connected to it in order to service the universities. Sell them equipment, provide advice, etc. It was all doable under this criteria. The next step was, I think, a key step, that several of these regional connecting companies, I think, I'm not sure who the first one was. I think it probably became PSI Network. I'm not sure. Decided, why should we remain not profit and constrained by the NSF government funding? Let's become commercial operations and spread out, because there was increasing demand from industry and others to have access to this data network, which was at that point. I'm probably at the early 80s. Dates get very mixed up at that point. And that happened, and rapidly the not-for-profit regional networks became for-profit networks. They established their own interchange protocols. Some of them were cost-free, some of them were not cost-free. But the thing that also happened was speed became considerably higher than 50 kilobits. As we got technology in place, and as the business opportunities became, the carriers developed higher and higher speed. It wasn't a big leap because the telephone industry had been using digital carriers for a long, long time. And so the underlying technology was there, but the products weren't. So basically the products started developed to service this field. Okay, so now you had a big launch. Big data networks that service companies, largely not that many companies, and all the academic worldwide eventually. Now you're going to get a big debate here of what happened next. This is my perspective of what happened. Some people will tell you, along came the web, and that sparked things. I would argue that, maybe not. There were browsers around running on machines for a long, long time. They were very useful. But I think what happened is the PC came along. And a bunch of kids in Boston took the TCP IP protocol stack and moved it over to DOS. Microsoft's.
Trumpet.
Huh?
Trumpet Winsock.
I'm talking about.
Trumpet Winsock.
I think there was an earlier version, but I'm not sure. Again, some of these facts I can fill in. I know the kids, but they also gave it away for nothing to anybody who wanted it. So now, rapidly, people had PCs, and they were becoming large numbers of PCs, and they could connect, sometimes through acoustic modems, eventually through more sophisticated connectivities. So as things like the spreadsheets suddenly blossomed with the PC and made a fortune for Mitch Kapoor. He had a nice jet, by the way. So that the proliferation of uses of the PCs and provided the home as they got more elaborate for things like web browsers, mail systems, etc. So it was, in some sense, the democratizing of the internet. Okay. At that point, things developed quite rapidly, but there were some breakthrough points. And I'm not trying to say that I was at the center of all of them, but I certainly was involved in many of them. Another proposal was made to the NSF. There was an interesting one to develop a gigabit capability on the network. We're running at 512 megabits per second, something below that. And the technology was out in the carriers, the network carriers, the data carriers for a gigabit or beyond. And so the proposal was made that can we develop the stuff necessary to run at a gigabit speed? And the NSF funded it. It was a joint university academic project, one of the more successful ones. And in fact, we managed to develop gigabit speed networks, which rapidly went into the commercial sector. Now, a given host on the machine, a given person didn't necessarily connect to a gigabit, but these routers and that were sitting inside the data networks could now talk to each other at very high speeds. And now we're working, 10, 20, 30 gigs, 100 gigs sometimes between these. Yeah, late 80s, early 90s. And again, these technological changes move things. Okay? And the capability of communicating in high speed made a market for connecting homes and businesses to these high-speed networks. So now, most of you have I don't know, what do I have at home? 100 megabits access for my house. Not in New York. I have a house.
And it's still too slow with the load times.
It's still too, well, the delay times are getting awful. And the reliability has gone down in some places. But still, the ability to communicate. Okay. Now, while this was happening, applications started being written, obviously. Now you had a market, even before the iPad and the cell phones came along, people were writing browsers and other things. Netscape wrote its first really commercial browser, which made a lot of money for the founders. Computers themselves were speeded up considerably. Memories got very large. Just to put a context on that, during the heyday of the early days of the net, a 64 megabyte computer was considered large. Now, anybody have anything under a gigabyte of information? You wouldn't know what to do with it. My phone has a large amount, put it that way. My phone has more power than Bell Labs had in its heyday, when it was the center of computing research. But each one of these steps made some things feasible. Okay? And so the fact that now the audience got bigger and bigger meant that more applications were put on it. And that steady evolution of customer base, not academic, although academics are a big part of it, so long as obviously the moneymaker. It is still the place where innovation tends to take place. Less so now than it was, but still important. So we're now in a world where, I should go to the next step. Along came these beasties. Okay. I had one of the early ones that I found very useful because it was about this big and weighed a ton. And as you wander around New York in those days, it was a good counter weapon if anybody tried to bug you. Hit them over the head with it, they'd be out for years. That also evolved very, very rapidly. Part of it was a large part of it was Finland. Nokia did a lot of revolutionary things, a lot of activities, and along came Apple with the iPhone, but Apple was a very late development. And there were compact phones around for a long time before that, but they tended not to be as flashy or as well adapted to the community. So now I would think that a significant amount of network traffic actually goes over the wireless system. I don't know the answer to how much, but it's significant. And I think it will increase as time goes on. We're all sort of mobile. And the U.S. is actually one of the least mobile places in a funny way. I mean, you go to China, you go to Japan, you go to most of Asia, and your speeds are much higher, connectivity is much better. Other things are not quite as good at times, but still, the speeds are there. And again, being a late comer to the game is always an advantage because you don't have established stuff in place. Yeah. Okay, nice and rosy, right? Everything's great? No. As this thing grew, a whole set of problems arose. I'm just going to enumerate or I'll stand up here for the next 2 hours. We have built an experiment. You have to realize that this was an experiment. The building of the first networks was an experiment. We didn't know how to do it. And the problem was, how do you make it work? How do you establish protocols to work, etc.? The last thing on our mind was, how do you establish secure protocols? It was hard enough to get them to work, more or less worry about securing them. So in fact, a whole set of things were developed which were ignoring some fundamental problems that are beginning to hurt us now. Our computers are not secure and probably are very hard to make secure. I mean, they're out there, there's nothing you can do. Our network protocols are continuously buggy. I think that's a polite way of putting it. Our operating systems are more buggy. as you witness the amount of updates you get from Apple. They seem to come every 2 minutes. Most of them are security updates. So we basically are sitting on a very shaky environment, a very useful environment. Most of us really don't care if the network breaks occasionally. It doesn't usually break. It's, somebody steals 100 million addresses. What the heck?
So what do you think, why do you think it's that system is that buggy?
Why is that buggy?
Yeah.
Because we don't know how to build software. I've been in the business for many, many years. We've gotten better at software, but our software has gotten much more complicated. Okay? The protocols are largely standardized. It's very hard to retrofit them. You're constantly running to keep in place, more or less fixing what's there. Our hardware is cast in silicon. It's very hard to fix it. And so we're constantly sliding. There are cures for that. I'm not going to, well, the cures are painful. But there are potential ways out for critical services. For the mass of people, it's difficult. About the only hope we have is to try to keep our software as current as we can. Right? It is difficult.
Nice answer.
And students, by the way,
Thank you, sir.
students are very good at finding problems of all type. So that's one problem. Okay? The other problems deal with governance. The network was never really governed. It was a cooperative activity. People sort of got together periodically. The protocols were defined, software was defined by volunteer organizations like the Internet Engineering Task Force, which tried to keep things from falling over. Companies, there were free software, etc. But basically, it's not a volunteer. It's a non-governed organization. People get together and do things because it's in their own self-interest, and they're not told to do it, but it's worked. As the internet gets bigger, remember the internet is everything, not just the connecting equipment. As the internet gets bigger, there's more and more desire on the parts of governments to control, more and more desire on the part of big companies to control. And that battle has been going on for a few years and will continue to go on. Different parts of the world have different laws that govern things. If you're in Europe, there's a lot of privacy regulation, which I just sat through a meeting. I forget the initial, GSPR or something. Yeah, the privacy rules, which are very difficult. Let's put it that way. But in fact, these are real problems, and they're problems which are going to affect not so much me. I won't be around that long, but especially your students are going to have to face them. They're going to have to face all of them. Okay?
So, David, since the question was asked and you're talking about it, do you get into now the trend towards these block stacks and blockchain systems where they're trying to bring some type of incentive-based system to solving these problems and issues?
There's a lot of it. There's a lot of these, let me call them experiments. Okay, blockchain is certainly an interesting one. We've been trying to use encryption for a long, long time to do the job. Let's see, close to 25 years ago, a bunch of us put together an email system that was fully encrypted. Be surprised nobody wanted it. Interesting. One could argue a number of things there. I'm not going to go there. Encryption is a very powerful mechanism, and we have a fairly good handle on it, much to the regrets of most governments which used to own that technology. There will be a lot of experiments. Some of them will work out very well. Some of them will be in danger because of the infrastructure they sit on. Blockchain is probably good, but what happens when blockchain sits on top of an insecure computer? I haven't looked at that much. We tend not to pay any attention to that until we live to regret it. I mean, there are just a whole host of problems. None of them tend to affect us immediately, but they will affect students who are coming out of universities. Yes, ma'am.
How do you feel about the current trends of internet and how it should be built is more driven by corporations and academics?
That's a very good question. Yeah, the question is a comment on more and more of the time the directions are being imposed by corporations. Is that a fair statement? How do I feel about that? That the power of the corporations. It worries me. Worries me a lot. They have usually, you realize that companies like Google, which started out with the thing, do no evil, have removed that from their motto. Okay? They don't talk about it anymore. Not that they do evil, but they, it's a very complex space. Corporations are responsible to their stockholders, and that is a problem. It's a problem in several ways. We no longer do the type of research that led to the development of the internet. Our research tends to be very short range. Other countries may not be so short range, but even there it's hard to tell at times. So in fact, the long-term research that developed the type of technology we have is not doable in the US anymore. There's some academic, but even academics now come into their research wondering when they can actually sell the idea to some company, get stock options, get acquired, and get out. That's not the way you do long-term research. So there are systemic problems. The tendency of organizations like ICANN with a lot of money to be able to occasionally think they're in the governance business is dangerous. I've been pushing for a long time to stop using the word internet governance, by the way. It's really internet management, which is completely different than governance. Our terms are dangerous. Okay? There's a lot of things we have to do to keep this momentum going. And I worry about it. I worry about countries establishing censorship, okay, and breaking a lot of the things that made the internet work. Companies deciding, you get into big arguments over this. For instance, Facebook's eliminated alt-right people. We're not going to wow them on. And everybody cheered, right? Got rid of them. The trouble is once you give the companies that right to do it, and there's no legal thing to stop them, then the question is, how about next week where they decide that, let's get rid of the alt-left people, or maybe this group of people. There's no law that stops them. The only thing that stops them is the commercial self-interest. And that will usually drive them, but that's switchable very easily. The 1 week you want to get rid of these people, but if you get rid of too many customers, let's change things. And you see that happening now. Europe tends to have a different attitude. But they're putting a lot of rules in place, maybe too many, but I'd rather too many and trim them back than too few. We are in potentially serious problems. I'm going to stop because I could go on for another 2 hours. But first, are there any questions?
Could you use the mic for the questions? There's a mic behind you over there.
Want to use the mic?
Although,
You have to talk. No, it's on. Just talk loud, too.
although the original my comment was more toward if the direction of internet is like if corporations control those with the mindful about how to make money out of it, just more fundamentally efficiency of the development goes down. That's my original sentiment. But besides that, current issue right now regarding the internet will be net neutrality debate, which we just You don't have to talk. Just yes, no. Yes, no. You
No,
concerned?
Can I give a 2 minutes? Let me split some issues here, okay? I've written endless papers on that, and some of my friends and some of my organizations would love to kill me at times. I served a year at the FCC, so I have some experience there. Net neutrality was a solution of a problem that didn't exist. Okay, that's the important thing. And it's always dangerous to put laws in to cover something that you don't have examples of. The FCC was perfectly capable of doing it. Until a court case came along, and the problem we got into is the court case said, under your current rules of classifying the internet as a information system, you can't impose these rules. And so Title I, so-called, the last administration decided, well, the cure for that was to make the internet Title II, which is a regulated carrier. That carries a lot of problems. First, under Title II, the FCC has a whole set of rules which they said they would not enforce. But it's not clear you can say that as a government agencies. If you have rules, somebody can go to court and say, you must impose those rules. It's in your view. And so there were a lot of very wishy, creepy things there. And it got intertwined with net neutrality. Okay. Now, the other thing which made it really dangerous is Title II common carrier, which that was, essentially forbid the FTC, you've got to change the name of one of those two, the Federal Trade Commission, from touching anything, because they are forbidden by law to deal with common carriers. So the FTC, which has the power to do things and the motivation to do things, was told, you can't touch these guys, right? And the FCC basically isn't equipped to do very much. They can fine people, but that's not all they can do. And fines, remember, mostly are tax deductible, so it doesn't hurt that much. FTC has little things like antitrust and other things which tend to get more attention. So there were some benefits in getting rid of Title II, because now the FTC can regulate. Net neutrality, it seemed to me to be something that we have to pay a lot of attention to. One can argue, and this is the economists arguing, and I wrote some joint papers on this with an economist from Penn, who was chief economist at the FCC when I was chief technologist. It's not in a company's best interest to say, no, you cannot do that, we will not service this. Because as long as there's competition, that tends to depreciate your market. And Comcast has said, we have no intention of doing any of that, because our market depends on open access to it. Whether that holds together, I don't know. Eventually, if it doesn't hold together, you'll get the Congress in the act. That's sort of scary right now, because God knows what the Congress would do. But eventually, that's, the current laws do not well adapt to the internet. And the international situation is much, much worse. It is chaotic. I think I may have said, I sat through a 3-day meeting the other day on European Asian cooperative research. Now, why it was held in Washington with me in the middle, I won't argue, since I'm the Asian. But anyway, it was clear that the impact of the European laws are going to be profound and very difficult for the U.S. and maybe difficult for a lot of the world. So it's a very complicated space. But back to, no matter what companies do, there'll always be this set of nasty little people who go and develop ideas. And as long as they can be funded, they will develop products. Now, it's getting harder with the big companies. Okay, because their tendency is to acquire the company and quietly sink something they don't like. You can see that time and time again. You don't get much protest out of that. But every once in a while, somebody pops up out of the muck down there. I suspect that's not going to happen in the Valley. And increasingly in academic world is getting harder because, again, this lure of why don't we go form a company and make money. But it may happen in the East Coast where there's less of this activity of get acquired by Apple, get acquired by Google. Pardon? Well, you don't need Silicon Valley. You just need innovative people and a way to get initial funding, and it doesn't take that much. So as we develop, Pittsburgh, for instance, where I taught for 6 years, is developing a fairly good entrepreneurial activity that's less, form the company and sell it. New York, you're beginning to see that happen more and more. So I think there's a chance of the East Coast. I think the West Coast is in deep trouble right now for a whole host of reasons, if it doesn't fall off the cliff. Okay, when we go. Yeah.
Hi. So.
Whoa, okay.
Hi. Sorry. Quickly, you touched on how it wouldn't be possible, or it would be very likely impossible to do the type of innovative research that used to be done. And I was wondering if you could even touch on maybe some of the circumstances or some of the necessary conditions that made those
work?
innovations possible.
Okay, I'll tell you the best one. Bell Laboratories was funded by AT&T. The agreement that AT&T made with the federal government back in the 20s, actually, that in return for a monopoly, although we didn't call it that, that AT&T would guarantee that the U.S. had the best telephone system around. And to make that happen, they were obliged to put either 4% of their gross or net, I can never remember which, towards research and development. Now, in an era where equipment was being written off over 40 years, development was less of a, you didn't develop new stuff just for fun. Okay, so here you had Bell Labs, which was getting a large amount of money. There were certain things that were known the telephone company would need, like electronic switching, so there were cases like that. But in general, there was too much money, and so you had basic research being done. And when I was there, at least, I did what I wanted to do. As long as I didn't get myself into too much trouble and need too much money, I could do anything I wanted. And if I needed equipment, I went up to the stock room and just took it out. Nobody cared. Xerox went through the same game with Park, Yorktown, IBM. They were all a time of richness. When things get tight, guess what happens? Research is deferrable, right? And so you'll notice that when times get tight, the first thing that happens is corporations defer research. Andy Grove, who was one of the co-founders, at least one of the early Intel employees, I'd call him a co-founder, basically said correctly that it's when things are bad that you want to invest in research, because you know things are going to be better and you want to be ready. Most companies don't realize that. Okay, so right now, for instance, 5 years ago, I can talk about that. Microsoft had a $45 million R&D budget. Sounds like a fair amount. Only $4 million of that was research. The rest was development. Development is not research. Okay, and you see that time. Google is no longer the company that spawns innovation, not as much. Now they look at their bottom line. Next quarter, stock options do a lot of damage there. Though I did well on them.
Since we are talking about history of CS, my question is, what should be our next goal for coming generation? What should be more focused on?
As a teacher?
As a teacher.
getting the kids to understand that the internet is not just what shows up on iOS or Apple stuff, and it's not just the browser. There's a much richer world. And as time goes on, in fact, innovation is going to be the name of the game. And that means that they need a broad base. Learning to code is not going to help them in a world where I'm dealing with, I hate the word AI, but I'll use it because we don't do AI. We do deep learning. And AI, the term AI, I was involved early on with some of the pioneers of AI, and what's being done now is not AI. But piece. AI requires a lot of skills over and above coding. In fact, very little coding. And thinking, innovation, things like that, that's something that you want to encourage students to pop up to the top. If they graduate from high school and that's the end of it, which seems to be the big push now, you don't need college, you do. There's just an awful lot of skills that you're not going to get by high school. But you can start it. You can start it by first acquainting them, getting them a word for the sociology of it all, the underlying stuff, okay, some of the serious issues of privacy, freedom, etc., as well as some coding. Yeah, coding's nice. I would tend to use fairly high-level languages myself, but I wouldn't focus on that. Get them to the point where they're really turned on.
I read many of these debates now over crypto and blockchain and governance, and I always feel at the end of these discussion threads, has anybody read or have they just forgotten about Plato's Republic? I mean, just go back, 2,400 years. And as a follow-on to this question, which is a good one, the internet was nothing 30, 40 years ago, very small. I call it the pimple on the voice elephant's behind,
Right.
if you will. But now it is the elephant.
It is the elephant.
And the voice is the pimple.
Right.
So does it behoove us, just as you said, you have to look beyond computer science to really the entire world, the entire range of academic studies incorporated into the computer science curriculum. And we can apply that as well to how do we frame these regulatory debates? Do we have to go back and look at the history of telecom regulation, dust it off, look at what happened in 1913, 1934, all these things, and say that's important stuff to know, and yet very few people know about those things today.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I'm not sure how deep I'd go into that, but at high school level, college level, I think we do ourselves a disservice in most of our computer science programs. There's no time for education. And that bothers me. I used to have a big fight. I taught a long time at Penn, University of Pennsylvania, and getting the computer science department to let in a course that was not technical was an act of God. What do you mean? We have so many courses to fill up. There are ways to cure that, and it's beginning to get cured. For instance, in the engineering, there's the ABET accreditation. ABET does accredit computer science, although most of the big schools stay away from it. But they are very powerful in putting in things to the engineering programs which deal with the sociology and legal structure of engineering. Getting that into computer science program, maybe skipping a course in basket weaving with computers would be very useful. Getting students to get acquainted with it in high school, where their minds are so susceptible to that, would be a big, big advantage. Yeah, then I should shut up sometime.
Thank you. Thank you. Just an observation. In listening to several different topics that you mentioned, there seems to be kind of the love of the binary. And when it comes to coding, that's great. But when it comes to considering how to manage complex issues, it's terrible. So in this latest issue we have that you just discussed, we have STEM versus humanities and the liberal arts, and that's creates a fallacy because, as you're saying, you really need the humanities, the liberal arts,
Yes.
Plato's Republic, sense of history in order to drive things. And that if you're looking at AI, it's not a STEM question alone. It can stem from that, so to speak, but it needs to move into broader considerations. And even going back to net neutrality, is it good? Is it bad? Yeah, is one thing right wing and one thing left wing? Is privacy good? Is security bad? These binaries are create fallacies and they create sides. When what we really need is to mix them together and to create a more collaborative sense of things and a more of a dialogue, so that these things talk to each other.
That's happening slowly in the universities, slowly, glacially slowly. And then part of it is the sometimes the academic world. You know, you have so many courses you want to cram in. But yeah, just to wrap up on one thing, a few things are complicated now. Wait, okay. And first of all, almost all I quote AI is neural nets. Our neural nets now are so complicated that we have no idea in the world of whether what they tell us is correct. And that is beginning to be a big, big, big problem. It's one that's going to get a lot of research. That means kids have to understand that it just ain't, coding per se. It's much richer than that now. And quantum computing is not that far away. And now that's not going to impact us for a long, long time, except all the security we put in through encryption will probably be useless after about 7 or 8 years from now. That will be breakable very easily. We'll have better encryption at that point. There are techniques already, lattice encryption. But all our past records, which are nicely encrypted, will be open book, because anybody will be able to decrypt them. So life never stops. I think is the best description. As I said, I have more computing power in this thing than we had for years in advanced research. In fact, my watch almost has more computing power, and that's just going to get more and more and more. I can talk to my telephone occasionally, and sometimes it even understands what I'm saying. But in fact, we can do much, much better than that, and will. So it will penetrate our society. Obviously, robotics and stuff, and self-driving cars and trucks, etc., are going to cause chaos in the job market. If we continue to teach kids who terminated in high school what we teach them now, I think they're unemployable. And there's so many hamburgers to flip, and even that can be automated. So, yeah, it's complicated. I could talk for hours on it.
Thank you, Dave. So we're blessed because he's staying in New York at the moment, and so we could get him down here.
Yeah, I'm over in Chelsea until May.
And so this is it was fascinating, but it has screwed up our timetable somewhat. But we had planned a little break at this point.
Can I just say one thing? If you want to get a hold of me, my email address is, everybody ready? Dave@Farber.net. The advantage of having one of my students being the guy who did the domain name system. Among many other addresses, that works most of the time.
And Dave curates a mailing list called Interesting People, and if you write him, and he'll put you on it. And he even forwards things from me occasionally. I'd like to thank you specifically for asking the question about computer science for schools. But it was a wide-ranging talk, which I think gives a lot of perspective on how we got to where we are. And I hope there's something in there that will be useful for you. And this, I will publish this in whole as a video, so you will be able to get to see it. So what are we going to take, like a 10-minute break to stretch our legs and the coffee, which has got a little bit cold. And then Ruben is going to present his